serves a good purpose. I don't know the motivations of all those who demonstrate. There may be some who would be trying to appease the Soviet Union. But the fact of the European demonstrations, the hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in Paris, Berlin, Rome, have made a great impact on our own country. And I believe that it served to inspire the leaders of our country, and perhaps others as well, to work more diligently to reduce the level of nuclear armaments. My own hope is that eventually we can completely eliminate all nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. In the meantime, the best goal is for a very small, relatively invulnerable nuclear force that can only be used for deterrence and not for initiating an attack. And I hope that we'll very quickly come to an agreement with the Soviet Union on reducing the intermediate range missiles that now cover Europe, and also very quickly bring in other nuclear powers, certainly France and Great Britain, in the overall discussions. So I think any drive to lower nuclear arsenal levels is good.
Den 57-årige Jimmy Carter var de Forenede Staters præsident fra januar 1977 til januar 1981. Før han kastede sig ind i kampen om det, der ofte kaldes verdens mægtigste embede, var han ukendt i både national og international politik. Oprindeligt uddannet ingeniør og flådeofficer blev han siden jordnøddefarmer i sydstaten Georgia. Han var også statens guvernør i en periode. Vælgerne stemte Carter ind i Det Hvide Hus i den bølge af afstandtagen fra det traditionelle politiske spil i Washington, som var fulgt i kølvandet på Vietnamkrigen og Watergate-skandalen. Ved sin tiltræden erklærede Carter, at han håbede at skabe et USA som verdens leder. Men ikke et lederskab baseret på militær magt, økonomisk pression eller politisk overtagelse, men på at USA handlede rigtigt og anstændigt. Carter ønskede at følge en politik på moralens og menneskerettighedernes grund. Carter fik hurtigt ry for at være en meget arbejdende og flittig præsident, men kritikken lød også, at han gik for meget op i detaljerne og blandede sig for meget, i modsætning til den nuværende præsident, der beskrives som værende modsat af Carter på næsten alle områder, også de menneskelige. Carters nye linje blev dog ikke modtaget lige godt alle steder, og hans præsidentperiode opfattes de fleste steder som hverken lykkelig eller fremgangsrig for USA. Den vesttyske kansler Helmut Schmidt kaldte lige ud Carter for uberegnelig, og også de øvrige vestlige ledere samt Sovjet klagede over en vaklende kurs i Washington, som det var svært at finde ud af. Man begyndte simpelthen at tvivle på, om USA var i stand til at bevare rollen som de vestlige demokratiers leder, og der opstod nye samarbejdsvanskeligheder over Atlanten. Delvis som følge af det andet olieprischok løb økonomien i USA af sporet med stigende inflation, arbejdsløshed og underskud på statsbudgettet som resultat. Udenrigspolitisk blev Carter dybt skuffet over den sovjetiske invasion af Afghanistan, og en ny aftale med Sovjet om begrænsning af det strategiske våbenkapløb, den såkaldte SALT II-aftale, blev nok underskrevet af Carter og Brezhnev, men aldrig ratificeret af den amerikanske kongres. Det var også under Carter, at USA's vigtigste og mangeårige allierede i Mellemøsten, shahen af Iran, faldt. Og som en indirekte følge heraf, at det nye regime i Teheran tog 51 amerikanske ambassadefunktionærer som gidsler i godt et år. Carters mange uheld og nederlag blev næsten symboliseret i den mislykkede redningsaktion for gidslerne i april 1980. Amerikanske redningshelikoptere brød sammen i den iranske ørken i aktionens allerførste fase. Verden over opfattedes gidselaffæren og redningsfiaskoen som voldsomt ydmygende for Carter og for USA. Men der var en stor succes for Carter, Camp David. Her lykkedes det for ham at mægle mellem Begin og Sadat, så det et halvt år efter var muligt for de to tidligere dødsfjender at underskrive den første fredstraktat mellem et arabisk land og Israel. Den israelske tilbagetrækning fra Sinai forleden var et af resultaterne af Carters fredsaktion i Mellemøsten. Vælgernes dom over Carter ved præsidentvalget i november 1980 var entydig. Ronald Reagan sejrede klart.
The reason for fear in this part of the world is very much the decision taken by NATO in '79 to establish the so-called Euro-missiles.
Yes.
And you were president at that time, so
Yes.
in fact, I mean, you are responsible for some of the fear in this part of the world.
Yeah, I understand. In June of 1979, I met with President Brezhnev in Vienna and offered to him a complete, total freeze on the production or deployment of all nuclear weapons. He refused because the Soviets were very eager to continue with the deployment of the very formidable SS-20 missiles. 5 or 6 months later, after Brezhnev refused to freeze the intermediate range missiles and others, the NATO countries all decided that we should deploy the Pershing missiles and the ground-launched cruise missiles as a partial meeting of the threat of the SS-20s. We can't afford to let the Soviets dominate Europe with a formidable force that can't be adequately met. Even then, most of us leaders in NATO saw the decision to deploy the Pershings and the ground-launched cruise missiles as a means to force the Soviet Union to negotiate in good faith for overall reductions in missile levels. But I think that this was a decision made almost, I think, unanimously by the NATO powers as a necessary response to a very genuine Soviet threat.
So you still believe that Euro-missiles should be deployed if the Soviet Union doesn't agree to dismantle their SS-20s?
Yes, I do. I don't think we can afford, as freedom-loving people, to put ourselves in a vulnerable position to a Soviet domination. And this, to me, is the best insurance for peace. The American nuclear force is very strong, very powerful. My own assessment as a former president is that the total balance of nuclear forces is equivalent. There are some areas where the Soviets are stronger, some where we are stronger. But the recent proposals by President Reagan, I don't know the details, I think are a move in the right direction. We've been now, ever since January of 1981, when I left office, without any discussions on strategic weapons, and I think this is a good move to begin the discussions again.
Mr. President, one of the arguments that the peace movement is using is that the deployment of Euro-missiles, American nuclear missiles in Europe, will raise tension and might even in its utmost consequence lead to a limited nuclear war in Europe. What is your comment on that?
I don't think the United States should ever try to force the European countries to deploy any weapon. The initiation of the move to deploy these theater nuclear force weapons came from Europe. The first leader who ever discussed it, for my knowledge, was Helmut Schmidt, who saw an imbalance. I think he called it a Euro strategic imbalance. He made a speech in October of 1977. And this was a joint decision made by all NATO powers. The United States has no use to defend our own country for the short range, intermediate range missiles. These are designed in response to a European initiative with our approval for use by the European countries. If the European countries decide they don't want to use missiles to defend themselves, or at least to have a balanced force, there's nothing that our country can do or should do to force our free and independent and autonomous allies to take action against your own will.
But could the United States take part in the defense of Europe should such a situation occur if they have no missiles of the kind we are talking of, the Pershings and the cruise missiles?
It would be much more difficult. I would like to see Brezhnev accept another proposal that I made to him in Vienna, and that was a mutual pledge of no first use of any military force in Europe. No conventional force to be used, no nuclear force to be used. This is the best thing that our two sides can do. NATO on the one hand, the Warsaw Pact on the other. But if we could have had a total freeze of all nuclear weapons, which I asked Brezhnev to accept, a very drastic reduction under SALT II and subsequently under SALT III, and a mutual pledge of no use of military force, I think that would have been the best thing to alleviate fears and to lead to more peaceful resolution of all our differences.
But should the United States give a unilateral pledge not to be the first to use nuclear weapons, as McNamara has recently proposed?
He hasn't proposed that. What McNamara and others proposed was, if the conventional force levels were approximately equal, then we would be willing to pledge a no first use of nuclear force. But until that happens, the best approach is the one that I made to Brezhnev, that is, a pledge of no first use of any military force, conventional or nuclear.
What kind of response did you get, Mr. President, from the Soviets when
He was not willing to do this.
He said it definitely.
That's right. And I think...
Did he give any reason?
He gave reasons, yes. Let me say this. I think that even now, President Reagan would be willing to agree to a non-first use of any military force. The Soviets will always take advantage of their areas of superiority. And there's no doubt that at the present time, the Soviets are superior in purely conventional forces. And we've had peace with the Soviet Union now for more than 35 years. As a matter of fact, we've never been antagonists of the Soviet Union in a war, as you may know from history. But I think one of the reasons is that the Soviets know that if they do attack our allies, then the punishment on their own people will be quite severe. And this deterrent use of nuclear forces is the best use.
When you live in Europe, it's a strange situation now. You can't really understand what has happened since the jolly days of '79 when you kissed Mr. Brezhnev in Vienna. What has really happened? Why all this talk about war today? Because are there really political tensions between the two superpowers?
Yes. Do you remember the years when the Nazi forces were in this area of Europe, and including Norway?
I was very young at that time.
Yes, but it's still a very vivid memory in the history of this region of Europe. Well, the Soviets are presently occupying Afghanistan with more than 100,000 troops, trying to subjugate the Afghan people, just as the Norwegians and others were dominated by the Nazi troops in the 1940s. And this unwarranted and ill-advised invasion of Afghanistan made a much greater impact upon the American people's conscience and consciousness, apparently, than it did in Europe. The European countries have been apparently very willing to accept the Soviet invasion of an occupation of Afghanistan. The sharp difference between Europe and the United States is that our people are not willing to accept with equanimity the presence of the Soviet troops in Afghanistan. We see it as a similar pattern to the Nazi troops.
And can you compare the Soviet Union with the Nazi regime of Germany?
You can compare the invasion of a freedom-loving, independent nation like Afghanistan with the invasion of this region of Europe during the 1940s.
Do you think the Soviets impose a real threat towards Europe, a real military threat?
It depends on whether they can contemplate a victory in Europe without very serious consequences to their own country. I think the main desire of President Brezhnev, my impression of him, is to keep war away from his own people.
Only from his own people?
From his own people. He obviously wasn't very interested in keeping war away from the people in Afghanistan. But I think that the Soviet citizens suffered so horribly during the Second World War, with 20 million killed, that an overwhelming desire on the part of President Brezhnev is to keep peace for the Soviet people. And the threat of retribution from the United States and from European countries, if the Soviets should invade Europe, I think has been a very effective deterrent.
But you mentioned before that we have now had peace with the Soviet Union for 35 years.
Yes.
But that is the same period as we have had the nuclear deterrence, the terror balance. But you also mentioned that you would like to see all nuclear weapons abolished from the earth.
Yes.
But wouldn't that create tensions? Wouldn't that lower the limit for wars?
I don't. It would lower the limit to prevent wars, yes, but it would also eliminate the possibility of the destruction of civilization. My own, I was in the Navy for 11 years, submarine officer. My last commanding officer was Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of nuclear propulsion in ships and also the generation of electric power. Last Sunday I had breakfast with him in Washington when I was on the way to Europe. And he expressed to me the wish that nuclear power itself had never been discovered. This has been his life's work. But he sees the threat of nuclear power as being so tremendous that even in the balance of some of its benefits for electrical propulsion and so forth, that he wishes it never had been discovered. I would like to see the same thing. And I believe that in the process of an orderly but persistent reduction in nuclear forces, we can maintain for a long time a deterrent with maybe a few submarines that can't be attacked, but which would be ridiculous to launch a preemptive strike. And at the same time, a commitment, a stronger commitment to disarmament through the mutual imbalance of force reductions, or maybe to the French proposal for a wider area of coverage of reductions. But I think the nuclear forces have served a purpose, and now I think that the threat of the nuclear destruction is a good basis for drastic reductions leading to a complete elimination.
To go back to Afghanistan, I remember when the invasion happened that you expressed fantastic disappointment with the Russians. Were you too naive about how they would act?
I've never doubted, since I've been in major office, that the Soviets were expansionist in their commitments. They want to extend their sphere of influence around the world whenever an opportunity presents itself. Sometimes through political means, sometimes through the free sale of weapons to a revolutionary group, sometimes through the use of surrogate forces like the Vietnamese or the Cubans, sometimes for direct involvement of a few Soviet advisors like in Ethiopia. But this is the first instance in several decades when the Soviets have been willing to use their own troops to extend the Iron Curtain to encompass another country like Afghanistan. And it was a surprise to me. I thought we were moving...
Surprise?
Yes, I thought we were moving very well with the Soviet Union, with the SALT II Treaty and other means, to have a better accommodation and a more peaceful world. But with their invasion of Afghanistan, this tore apart the building mutual confidence that we had with the Soviet Union.
Why did they do it?
I think it was a terrible mistake. I believe the Soviets have built for themselves now a similar instance that we experienced in Vietnam. Even though they've built up their forces to perhaps 120,000, they still have not been able to dominate or subjugate the freedom-loving and very courageous Afghan fighters. The territory where the Soviets control is a very small part of Afghanistan. And I believe that Soviets also underestimated the condemnation of the rest of the world. I think about 120 nations voted to condemn the Soviet Union in the United Nations. And many of the developing countries that had formerly trusted the Soviet Union and believed the Soviet propaganda were disillusioned with the Soviet invasion. I also think that one benefit, perhaps, from the Soviet presence in Afghanistan was that they didn't go into Poland. I've always thought that if the Soviets had not already been embroiled in the Afghanistan invasion, that they would have gone into Poland with their own troops.
What would interest an ordinary people would be to hear what kind of conversation did you have with President Brezhnev after they invaded Afghanistan? How do you talk with each other in that situation?
Yes. I've just finished writing a book, and I would hope that people maybe later this year will buy my book and read the account.
They can buy it for the details.
Yes, buy for the
details.
details.
Brief now.
Well, I corresponded regularly with President Brezhnev from the first days I was in the White House. And sometimes I wrote letters to him in my own hand with a fountain pen and mailed them to him. On more urgent occasions, I used a hotline, which is a direct tie. And late at night, I would send him a message, and by the time I woke the next morning, his reply would be in my hands. And on many occasions, we cooperated in trying to reduce tension. Once, I remember, in Lebanon. When he went into Afghanistan with the troops, we monitored very carefully every airplane which was bringing Soviet troops into the Kabul area. And this airlift began in late summer of 1979. By November and December, the number of Soviet military and civilian advisors had built up beyond any reasonable need. And about Christmas time, as you may remember, there were large numbers of flights. Sometimes 200 airplanes in one day were flying from the Soviet Union into the Kabul airport. We could monitor with our various means every flight. And I sent a warning to him that he was excessively building up Soviet forces there. He described in some vague, evasive language the fact that there was an external threat to Afghanistan, and that he had been invited in by President Amin to help protect Afghanistan. Well, as soon as the Soviet troops got into Kabul, they killed President Amin and his family and installed a puppet that had been brought in with the Soviet troops from Moscow. President Brezhnev, after this invasion, received some very stern warnings from me about the serious blow to détente and the severance of good relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. He promised me in his personal messages that the Soviet troops would be withdrawn. And later, when we had the Economic Summit Conference in Venice in June of 1980, he repeated this promise to me and to Giscard d'Estaing, to Helmut Schmidt, and to the leaders of Great Britain, Italy, Canada, and Japan, and promised that he would never build up his forces any further. At that time, they had about 80,000 troops. Now they have 120,000. So he's broken his promise. And he still refers, through some kind of strange diplomatic language, that there's some sort of external threat to Afghanistan, and he's there to protect the country from this external threat. The only external threat to Afghanistan is from the Soviet Union, obviously.
President Brezhnev is reported ill, very ill, some reports say, and is also a man of quite a high age. How do you think the situation influences the decision-making in the Kremlin?
Well, the first time I ever heard about President Brezhnev, he was reported to be very old and very ill, and I think he might very well outlast all three of us. Shortly before I met with him in 79, he had been to France to meet with President Giscard d'Estaing, and also had been to Bonn to meet with Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. And both of those leaders reported to me that he was extremely feeble. When he arrived in Vienna, he has a slight dizziness. He has to be careful how he walks. But I found him to be very strong and a very vigorous leader. There were several other Soviet advisors there with him, Chernenko, Gromyko, Ustinov, Ogarkov. And there was no doubt that Brezhnev was in command of the Soviet side of the negotiating table. He had some difficulty speaking. His lower jaw seemed to be restrained. But after he spoke for a few minutes, that speech impediment disappeared, and he didn't have any difficulty at all. I spent an hour or two with him just alone, with only an interpreter present, and found him to be grandfatherly in his attitude, very friendly to me, very frank in his discussions. One of the very strange things that he said when I had my first private meeting with him, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said to me, Mr. President, God will never forgive us if we fail. And coming from an atheist, communist leader, this was a very strange thing for him to say. We were talking about the SALT II and the SALT III process, and it was a very serious comment that he made, and a very personal, friendly comment that he made. When we had our next negotiating session, I spoke and said, yesterday President Brezhnev said that God would never forgive us if we failed. And President Brezhnev was quite embarrassed that I would refer to his comment about God.
But you failed.
No, we didn't fail.
The treaty was never ratified.
The treaty is still in effect, and it hasn't, it is still a live treaty. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, it was impossible to get 2/3 of the senators to ratify it. So the Democratic leaders in the Senate and I decided to keep the treaty alive, to keep it in the Senate, in the breast of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and it's still there. And both the United States and the Soviet Union are observing almost all of the terms of the SALT II treaty. The only exception that I know about is a requirement that the Soviets dismantle about 10% of all their nuclear launchers. They have not done that. But with that one exception, the SALT II treaty is still effective.
Is NATO at the moment in some kind of a crisis, one could say, in danger? Because there is this feeling, we hear about that in the States, that a lot of our Americans are saying at the moment the Europeans could stew in their own juice because they are not really willing to defend themselves, they are not willing to help the US in defending our democracy in other parts of the world. Is there that kind of feeling in the States?
There's a growing feeling of that kind. It's not so strong now as it was shortly after the Vietnamese War, when the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Mike Mansfield, was calling for a 50% reduction in American forces in Europe. We now have more than 300,000 American military personnel in the European area, and there is still an overwhelming support in our country for our full NATO role to be fulfilled. And as I said earlier in this interview, if it would be a mistake for the United States ever to try to force the sovereign members of NATO to act against your own will. But if it should ever happen that the NATO forces or political leaders chose not to defend yourselves, then I think the American forces would be inclined to withdraw, and the American people would have an aversion to the tremendous investment that we make here. I don't believe that many Americans believe that we are doing Europe a favor by defending freedom and democracy here. We look upon this as a mutual advantage for Europe and for us to defend democracy, to defend the Western way of life, to protect human rights, and to keep our people's freedom. It's an investment that pays rich dividends for us all.
But do you yourself, Mr. President, see a trend towards neutralism in Europe?
Yes.
You see it?
Yes, I do see it.
You have felt it during your visit now?
I felt it some during my visit, not as much as previously. The greatest disappointment for me personally was a lack of support in Europe for our action to induce the Soviets to withdraw from Afghanistan. As a president of a great, powerful country, we had three alternatives. One was military action, which was not practical or advisable. The second was political action, which we took through the United Nations and through other means. And the third was economic action. And the economic action was very damaging to our country with its sale of grain and so forth. It was also very unpopular for me to take politically. But the European nations very quickly decided to forgive the Soviet Union and to forget the invasion forces being there in order to continue their full trade and their full benefits with the Soviet Union. This was a very disappointing thing to me, and I think was a most serious indication of neutrality in the relation between our country and the Soviet Union.
Let me be precise.
Yeah,
Mr. Schmidt was very critical of you sometimes.
Yeah,
he called you
privately.
unpredictable.
Privately, he was very critical of me, yes.
Also on the
privately.
record.
Perhaps. Well, I can't claim that we always agreed with all the leaders. And I think Helmut Schmidt is a very good and a very strong leader. He's always been quite critical of our country's policies and has an excessive tendency to blame the ills in Germany, economic or otherwise, on the United States. This is a natural tendency on the part of many political leaders to blame problems on someone else.
I've seen a comment that he wouldn't be satisfied before he is in the White House himself. Would you agree?
Let other people say that. But I think the overwhelming relationship during my term in office, including Helmut Schmidt, between myself and him and between the people of Germany and the United States were very good.
You said that you don't believe in a limited war, so it would be Holocaust or total destruction, more or less. But you, while you were president, you had the responsibility to take the decision to press a button. Do you really believe you could do that if you knew it was Holocaust?
Well, it's better not to discuss the details of that kind of thing, but the point I want to make is that we should never depend upon the use of nuclear weapons as a limited force. We should assume that once a nuclear war is launched in a certain region, like Europe, that it will extend to our own country. It gives an additional powerful constraint on the use of nuclear weapons, and it also moves one step better by making a powerful constraint on the use of any military force. And to try to play around with a distinction between a conventional invasion of Europe and a nuclear response is a mistake. The best approach between our country and the Soviet Union is still what I proposed to Brezhnev in 1979, and that is a mutual commitment of no use of military force in Europe. It's just a matter of semantics when you say, okay, you can invade with your conventional forces and sweep across Europe and subjugate the European people. We will not use nuclear forces. Even if someone made a promise like that ahead of time, it would be a very serious, a very difficult promise to keep. So the best place to have the tripwire is before a major military action is taken by the Soviet Union. That's the best place to stop it.
President Carter, you have said, I think it was on Swedish television the other night, that the most important single factor leading to your defeat in 1980 towards Reagan was the hostage affair in Iran.
Yes.
Do you today regret that you did not take earlier and stronger action?
No. I've probably thought about this as much as any decision I've ever made, not just now, after I'm out of office, but while I was there. The 1980 year was a very difficult one for me, not because of the election, but because the hostages were always on my mind. At the end, there were 52 Americans there, and I knew at all times I could have destroyed Iran. I could have wiped Tehran off the map and bombed the Abadan refineries and closed all the harbors. But I had to make a decision between that kind of action and a very unpopular political decision of patience and restraint, trying at the same time to protect the interest of my country and to preserve the lives of those hostages and hopefully work for their ultimate freedom. I never knew that they would not be killed or kept. Well, it worked out well. In spite of the fact that I lost the election, our nation's interests were protected. The hostages came home free.
But you took military action. It ended in disaster, but you took military action.
No, we never took any offensive military action.
No, but I'm thinking of the failed rescue.
Well, the rescue attempt was designed in order to avoid bloodshed. These troops were highly trained to go in. They had strict orders from me not to harm anyone, to protect the lives of all possible. Some of my military advisors thought we should have diversionary attack, for instance, to bomb the Abadan oil refineries. I forbade that because I felt that if the rescue effort was successful or unsuccessful, that we should come out of Iran without bloodshed. And this was the way the hostage rescue attempt was conducted. We had contact with several dozen Iranian citizens who passed the desert area. We never hurt one of them. And it was just a terribly unfortunate accident, as you know, when one of our helicopters flew into the nose of a C-130 transport plane. That was the casualties involved. But I think that rescue attempt was well advised. It was carefully planned. It had a good chance for success. And of course, it was a tragedy that we lost the 8 men in the desert, but we tried to do it in a peaceful way.
Brzezinski, your national security advisor, recently wrote about how he experienced the seconds when you learned about the failure, and he wrote the other day about you. He put down the telephone, looked at me, and confirmed that the mission was aborted. He then put his head down on top of his desk, cradling it in his arms for a few seconds. I felt extraordinarily sad for him, as well as for the country. None of us said anything. What did you think, Mr. President?
I was disappointed. And we had been planning for this for many days. But I think he also said that I
took it cool, yes. But what did you think in those crucial moments?
Well, I was praying that that the hostages' lives would not be endangered, that the rescue force could be withdrawn without sending the Iranians into a frenzy of fright, where they might kill the hostages thinking they were being invaded, and the need to get our forces out of Iran before their presence was discovered, which we did. The Iranians never knew that our rescue mission was in Iran until all our people were out, and until we made the public announcement that they had been there, that their mission was peaceful, and that they had all withdrawn. And I think because of that, we avoided the very excitable militants, the kidnappers, from perhaps executing our people. That was the thing that I feared most.
One last question.
Yeah, Mr. President, you came from Georgia without having much international experience or
Yes.
experience in national politics in the States. How did it affect you as a human being to hold those enormous powers for 4 years?
I don't think it affected me much. Most of the people close around me, my staff members, my family members, don't think I've changed in any appreciable way from the 4 years experience in the White House. It was a wonderful life for me, both the good times and the disappointments, the times of relaxation and rest, and the times of tension and decisions that were difficult. But I enjoyed the 4 years very much, and hope that in the scope of history I contributed some good things, and I've also enjoyed my life since I left the White House.
You were known as Mr. Nice Guy in the White House. Is it possible to be a nice guy in the White House?
Well, one of the most serious allegations against me in the 1980 campaign was that I was mean, because I was listening very carefully to the statements that were being made by President Reagan about his attitude toward China, his attitude toward strategic arms talks, his tax policies, his defense policies, and they were of great concern to me. And when I pointed out what he was promising, the news media thought that I was a very mean person to be doubting his goodwill. The fact is that he meant what he said, and he has very deep commitments to these policies, and he's now put many of them into effect. So sometimes you have to be a tough guy, sometimes you have to be a nice guy. But in a position of responsibility like that, when you have control of such enormous power and influence, you have to be firm when necessary, but also show a gentle nature. And I always felt that my country was so powerful and so strong that I did not have to show or prove our military strength. I could be gentle with the Panamanians in the Panama Canal treaties, and I could go out of my way for days to try to bring peace between Israel and Egypt. And when I had a chance to destroy Iran or be patient with the hostages, I could afford to be patient. So there's a balance between knowing you have great strength and the moderation of not having to demonstrate it.
Will you run again, yes or no?
My preference is to support Fritz Mondale and not to run again.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
President.